Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We'll be talking with Professor Martin Puchner about storytelling and climate change. In his Literature for a Changing Planet, Professor Puchner brings forth vital lessons drawn from 4,000 years of world literature about how we put ourselves on the path of climate change and how we might change paths before it's too late. Martin, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here and talk about literature and climate change. The assumption here is that, of course, the most important discipline in a way to address climate change is science and engineering. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But the last 40 years have, I think, taught us that better climate change and better engineering solutions aren't enough to change people's behavior. And so there's been a lot of thought about how to change people's behaviors, how to change people's minds in psychology and in other disciplines. And this is where I see the discipline of literature and storytelling to come play a role, perhaps an important role in changing the way people think. The assumption here is that we are, in some sense, storytelling animals. Stories are a vehicle for orienting ourselves in the world. We always tell ourselves stories about the world and our place within it. And so stories are important motivators, and understanding them and understanding how that works may be important in this context. And these thoughts are I put down in a short book that's coming out in January. So mostly what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the main ideas here. But I also want to backtrack a little bit and talk about how I came to write and think about something on the scale of 4,000 years, because most humanists select much smaller units of analysis, and for very good reasons, often 10, 20 years, maybe 50 years, 100 years, rarely more than 150 and 200 years. And this was the case with me. My original specialty is 19th and 20th century literature. But then about 15 years ago, I stumbled into this project, the Norton Anthology of World Literature, a massive 6-volume undertaking with lots of collaborators that was a really eye-opening experience for me. I realized not just how narrow my earlier perspective on literature and culture had been, but also that that narrow perspective in a way had prevented me from asking and answering some of the most fundamental questions about literature and culture, even though I had been studying and teaching literature for decades at that point. Among those fundamental questions were things like, when was writing invented? How often was writing invented? What is the broader shape of literary history? What's the role of writing technologies? And how does oral storytelling interact with written literatures? And so I realized that only by taking that bird's eye view with that larger perspective would I be able to answer these questions. So based on the work on the anthology, I started this process of piecing together, in some sense, the basic story of literature from its beginnings. And since that plays a role in what I think literature can contribute to our work on climate change, I just want to walk you through very briefly some of these episodes. The story starts in Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago, when writing is invented in one particular form, namely cuneiform writing, in one particular medium, namely clay tablets or clay letters, this one from the Harvard Art Museum. So this started for me an interest in the role of different writing formats, writing systems, and writing technologies. Moving, for example, from cuneiform tablets to the scroll, and here in the case of the Hebrew Bible, alphabetic writing, And also the invention in this case here with the Hebrew Bible of something very important, namely sacred scripture. The association of writing and religion became very crucial for the subsequent cultural history. And like all things, it had to be invented in a certain time and place. Nothing natural about it. I mentioned writing technologies, and this is an important episode here. A Buddhist sutra, the Diamond Sutra. In this particular copy, the earliest surviving printed scroll in the world from 868, many centuries before Gutenberg. Gutenberg is still much too often credited with having invented writing. And it's not just a printed scroll, it's printed on paper. In paper in that history, for me, became actually a really crucial technology, almost as important as print. Paper, also invented in China, next travels to the Arabic world, where in a sense it underwrites or fuels the golden age of Arabic letters before it enters Europe via Arab-occupied part of Spain, where it reunites with print and leads to the second print revolution associated with Gutenberg. So in a sense, this is one story of writing and writing culture across the globe, but it's really only part of the globe. It's really the Eurasian continents. And it's interesting that all of these early writing cultures I mentioned, Mesopotamia, China, the Near East, here, Europe, are on that landmass, on a single landmass, and we're at least in indirect contact with each other, which would provide one answer to the question, how often was writing invented? How many origins of literature are there really? There may have been only one. If there hadn't been a completely independent literary tradition that evolved in the Americas, in Mesoamerica, with the Maya writing, a completely interesting and fascinating literary tradition that literary scholars and cultural scholars don't think enough about, and I became a big proselytizer of this particular text. Another case study that's part of that larger big picture question is the relation between orality and writing. And here, my favorite example is an African epic of Sunjata, that existed in oral form for many centuries, as many of the other texts did as well, but wasn't interesting written down until the 20th century. It existed side by side with different writing cultures, but really only was written down in the 20th century, which allows us to observe precisely how that process happened and how complicated it is. So this is the kind of big picture thinking I've been doing based on the work on the anthology that led to the book that Jonathan mentioned, The Written World, where I tried to really think about, based on the most influential texts in literary history, and many of them are collected in anthologies like the Norton Anthology, and trying to research how they managed to exert that influence, what stories really managed to survive and thrive, through what technology, through what translations, how they moved across the globe. So it was at this point that I started to think that this kind of big picture thinking could also perhaps offer a corpus of text, an interesting perspective on the topic of storytelling and climate change. In some sense, that's not a new topic. There is the relatively small discipline of eco-criticism or environmental humanities that has been studying the representation of nature and other questions connected to climate change. The thing about that discipline, however, is that, like most of literary studies, it's looked at very small units of analysis, often single text, single authors, and it's mostly focused on the literature of the past decades or the past centuries. So here I thought this much broader perspective, this sort of big picture approach, might yield interesting results and contribute something that hasn't been as present in this conversation, namely the deep history of storytelling, these foundational texts and foundational stories, both literary and religious, that have shaped humanity. What do they yield once we look at them with our current interest in climate change? So to give you one little snippet of this kind of interest, I want to return to the beginning of the literary tradition, namely the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in those cuneiform letters on clay tablets that I began by showing. And the Epic of Gilgamesh is a really great example that you don't need to turn, or that it's not enough to just look at recent climate fiction, which is great, and I'm happy to talk about it more later, but that we need this much wider optic. Because the Epic of Gilgamesh is really a fascinating text from the perspective of climate change, once you start looking for it. Now, at first blush, it doesn't seem to be the case, because the story of Gilgamesh is that of a king, King Gilgamesh, the ruler of the city of Uruk, who is an unruly king. So the gods create a companion, Enkidu, as a kind of sidekick to rein him in a little bit, to absorb some of his excessive energies. So this they do. And so the rest of the epic becomes a kind of buddy movie where these two friends, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, go on adventures. The most famous adventure is when they go and kill a monster, the monster Humbaba, and return in triumph. So this is the broad outline of the story. So you might ask, what does this have to do with climate change? Well, once you start reading the text with that in mind, it's surprising how much this text can yield. Let's start with this sidekick the gods create, Enkidu. Enkidu originally, after it's been created out of clay by the gods, is a wildling. He lives in the wild. He lives with animals. He drinks water. He does not associate with humans. Enkidu literally has to be seduced into the urban space. And here it's important to know that Uruk, the place where this epic takes place, is one of the first urban spaces in the world. We are here really at the beginning of the urban revolution, thanks to more intensive forms of agriculture that allow the society to amass up to 50,000 people in a single urban space. It's unheard of and really novel. And this epic very much defends this kind of urban lifestyle. So Enkidu, as I said, has to be seduced into the space. Literally, they send a woman to seduce Enkidu, which results in all the animals shun him, and Enkidu has to throw in his lot with humans. He, instead of water, he drinks beer. Instead of raw food, he eats bread. He shaves his beard and becomes an urban dweller and friend of Gilgamesh. So the story is really invested in that difference between the wilderness outside the city walls and civilization within. And then, as I mentioned, the two go off on an adventure to kill the monster Humbaba. Now, this is a very interesting monster because the monster is the guardian of a forest. And why do the two, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, try to kill this forest monster? Not just for fame, not just because that's what heroes of epic fiction do. This is really the first epic, so there isn't really a model for it. The real reason why they kill the monster is revealed after the killing. When they start their logging expedition, they want to bring back timber because the urban revolution has led to deforestation in Mesopotamia, which means that rulers like Gilgamesh have to go farther and farther afield to bring back timber for roofs and doors and other building projects. And this is what the two of them do. So we have here in this epic really this moment of resource extraction, of defending and glorifying a lifestyle that depends on this kind of resource extraction and couches it in epic, heroic terms. So this is just a brief sketch of the kind of reading that we can do with world literature, and that shows that some of the habits and lifestyles and modes of living that we've been engaged in have deep roots in literature, and more or less the entire literary tradition, wants to start looking for it, has been part of defending that lifestyle. I want to come back to the Epic of Gilgamesh one more time, because there is, of course, it's also the source of the story of the flood that subsequently made it into the Bible. And it's interesting that this text, which is so invested in resource management, in urban lifestyle, would include the story about the catastrophic flood that can only be saved, from which the Noah figure in the story, called Utnapishtim, can only save humanity through essentially an engineering solution, namely the building of the ark. It's more or less exactly the story that we know from the Bible, though with much less of a moral, sinful notion of sin and punishment attached. And I am happy to talk a little bit more about that. So all of this, just the first great text of world literature, and a lot of the themes, a lot of the problems that we are grappling with are already there at that moment of origin almost 4,000 years ago. So this is just supposed to give you sort of a little bit of a taste what happens once you start to mine, if to use that loaded metaphor, world literature for insights about climate change. And that, in a way, this goes much deeper than recent climate fiction. So this is, in a sense, one half of the project, the look back, the look at 4,000 years and trying to see what those 4,000 years yield. But of course, we are not just interested in looking what went wrong or what literature contributed to the problem of climate change, or why it may have now stand in the way of solving climate change, because these deep, often religious, epic, fundamental stories have laid down certain habits of thought or defend certain habits of life that now, in some sense, need to change. So this is sort of this critical historical exercise. But we can also approach this whole question from a different perspective, namely the question, what stories should we tell now? And this is the second contribution I think literature can make, because it has a fairly wide and sophisticated understanding, literary studies, that is, because we literary studies have a relatively sophisticated understandings of different types of stories and what they yield. And to introduce this interest in different story types, I want to show you just a few minutes of a screen, of a video, Kurt Vonnegut talking about story types. It's just under 4 minutes long.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now, this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now, this is an exercise in relativity, really. Is the shape of the curves are what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average. Is why get a depressing person? We'll start the whole thing. We call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Find something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again. People like that. Now, these are beautiful curves, and this gets a little complicated. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization. As we love to hear this story, every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, surprisingly enough, I've said it's depressing. You know, people don't like stories about below average days and people. But we're going to start way down here. Worse than that, who is so low? It's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with two nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. See? Anyway, there's a party at the palace that night. She can't go. She has to help everybody else get ready. She has to stay home. Now, does she sink lower? No. She's a staunch little girl, and she has had the maximum whack from fate, which is the loss of her mother. She can't go any lower than that. Okay, so the fairy godmother comes. Gives her shoes, gives her stocking, gives her mascara. Gives her a means of transportation, goes to the party, dances with the prince, has a swell time. Boring, 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 boring. Now there's a slight inclination to that line as I've drawn it because it takes perhaps 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a grandfather clock to strike 12. Does she wind up at the same level? Of course not. She will remember that dance for the rest of her life. Now, she poops along on this level till the prince comes, the shoe fits. She achieves off-scale happiness.
All right. So this is Kurt Vonnegut on story shapes. And as you've heard, there are these three story types that he singles out. And they are, as he says, really fundamental story types, but these are not the only story types that scholars have identified. I want to just throw another couple at you that are very high on the list of the most popular story types, and that may have some implication for climate change. Stories of rebirth can also be stories of conversion, of some fundamental change that happens in the hero's life. Stories of overcoming monsters, like the one in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a very basic and very common story type. Is it useful for climate change? Maybe that's something we can discuss. Genie out of the bottle, wishes and curses. Perhaps that's the kind of story. This one from the Arabian Nights, Pandora's box. Sometimes I feel like that's a certain type of story about climate change that it's become very popular, coming also from the deep history of world literature. Conflict with God. Here we are back to Noah and the flood, or Utnapishtim and the gods, that there is some kind of divine retribution, sin, and punishment. And finally, apocalyptic stories, another religious type of story that seems to be a default certainly for our current climate fiction. All of these stories come from the deep history of literature. They seem to be the stories that we default to when we try to make sense of the mess we are in right now. The question is, are these the right stories or not? So this is looking at literature from the perspective of story types. But there is another perspective I'd like to offer, one particularly important for climate change, and that is the question of agency. Now, all of the stories I've mentioned so far have basically a single hero as an agent. Joseph Campbell, very influential, overwhelmed by the different kinds of stories that are out there, basically went through an exercise of boiling them all down to a single story, namely the single story of a hero with 1,000 faces on a quest. Very influential in Hollywood. If you are a screenwriter in Hollywood, you will read this book and you will recognize a lot of Hollywood movies based on this book. The problem perhaps for us is that it's always a single hero. And so this strikes me as a very limiting kind of story when it comes to mitigating climate change, which is why I've been trying to think about what kinds of stories or types of literature exist that have collective agent. And one maybe strange genre is the manifesto, different manifestos, starting with the Communist Manifesto. I was interested in these texts, not so much for the content, communism, but the way these texts try to think about collective agents and how to motivate collective agents. So this is another question for us as we think about what kind of stories we should tell today. Do we need stories with a single hero, even though they may have 1,000 faces? Or do we need to think about texts with collective agents? There have been manifesto-like texts in the climate movement in various ways, but it's interesting that there isn't a sort of a single climate manifesto that has emerged. And I have some thoughts about why that is, why we shy away from the collective storytelling that takes place in manifestos, both political and art manifestos. And the final story type that I want to mention is actually also an ancient story form, namely the collection of stories, story collections, often frame tale story collections like the Arabian Nights, but there are many cultures produced these story compendia that collect different kinds of stories written by different authors, by different agents, and frame them all with a kind of frame story. And given how diverse and multifaceted the problem of climate change is, I sometimes think maybe we should take our clues from that ancient form of literature, namely these old story collections, and how they weave together different stories that come from different perspectives and different registers and different walks of life into a kind of coherent whole that looks at a certain problem from different perspectives and add to one another. So here, this is sort of the image I want to leave you with. So different types of stories that we can extract from world literature, some of the most important stories, and different agents that are collected with that. So that's the kind of thinking, or that's the kind of contribution that I think literature, especially world literature, can make by making us conscious of the kinds of stories that shape cultures, that float around in our world, in our heads, that we seem to default to when it comes to providing orientation, including and especially in climate fiction. So I want to stop here and start the second part, namely a conversation.
Martin, maybe you could start with, you've given us 6 or 9 different forms of stories. When you're thinking about climate change or stories of climate, what's one of the story forms you think was most surprising, would be most surprising to hear that actually was related to climate change at all? Like as you've been writing about this, what's one story form that you think is
Well, I suppose one would be comedy.
Say more.
Well, it's interesting that we have certain defaults. One is the sort of dystopia, which is a separate story. Dystopian fiction is mostly a 20th century invention, emerges very strongly in mid-century, really in response to totalitarianism, and then morphs into climate dystopia. So that's the utopia dystopia is an interesting form, and that's clearly very prevalent. We have, apocalyptic stories that envision the end of the world, and it's clearly that's a story type that's become very prevalent. If you look at broad history, it's interesting that in certain cultures it waxes and wanes, but end of the world stories clearly emerge at times of incredible upheaval. They did in certain moments in the Middle Ages, in the Christian Middle Ages. There are different apocalyptic scenarios, for example, in the Maya tradition, having to do with the calendar and calendar counts. And they're very much with us now. But so comedy is an interesting genre because it's and comedy is not just stories that are funny, although there's laughter too, but comedies traditionally are stories about everyday life, about the foibles of everyday people, about common people rather than elevated characters, about heroes in epics. It's about the material world, that you stumble over things, you bump into walls, you bump into each other, things go wrong. So comedies are about everyday life and the material constraints of everyday life. And in some ways, it seems to me that basic predisposition would lend itself to climate change, which is in part, yes, it's about certain engineering solutions and science, but it's also about changing everyday habits, about small changes, certainly about material constraints. So I sometimes think that comedy is the genre that, broadly speaking, that's underexplored in climate change fiction.
Interesting, because you're pointing out a couple of things. I mean, as you say, first of all, that you're implying the climate change we now think of as, an automatic decline or decline towards disaster. But you're pointing out that Gilgamesh was talking about industrialization. And, I wonder to what extent, as you've been reading the literature of the last 4,000 years, do you find that there are distinct trends? There are times when the literature of climate change is about improvement and progress versus times when it's about nostalgia for the bucolic past, or that there's always some of each?
Yeah, there's actually relatively little nostalgia in most. Nostalgia for nature is something that's really, there are some exceptions, but it's really only part of the literature of the last few hundred years. For the longest time, the wilderness is threatening. The wilderness, and this is what I think Gilgamesh is very much about, that wilderness is threatening. Wilderness is there as it's inhabited by wildlings like Enkidu who have to be seduced into urban spaces. It's inhabited by monsters that have to be slayed so you can extract resources. So this, I would say, is a very typical. It's not seen as a depletion. It should be. I think that's part of the problem. It doesn't present itself that way, but nature is not seen as something to be desired or to be preserved, or there's certainly no concept of sustainability. I mean, if I just think of a couple of random examples, another great epic author, Virgil, wrote a whole work on agriculture, on Roman agriculture, which is itself a fascinating fact. And once you think about literature and you pay attention to the role of agriculture, I think you have, I think that's a very useful perspective. This is all about cultivation, about improvement, about transforming the land, about techniques and technologies. it's quite an, and it's certainly not a pessimistic text. It's a text that prides itself on these very mundane practices and elevates them into literature. So those are just two early examples that come to mind. The literature of sort of either nostalgia or desire for fleeing into the countryside. The countryside is a place where you can sort of replenish, that sort of a way to get away from the city, really starts in a big way only with Romanticism, so 250 years ago. And then, goes from there. And so I think from our perspective, both of these great trends, the trend of nature as resource and resource extraction, and the more recent romantic trend of nature as to flee civilization, I think are equally unhelpful, I would say. And so we probably need to rethink both.
Huck Finn lighting up in the territories isn't helping anybody. Let's flip to the other, which is the apocalypse and the dystopia, because we have a number of good questions about those. And as you mentioned, even apocalypse is hardly new. I mean, there was the flood, for example, but increasingly we're seeing so much literature about, as you say, dystopias, a form of response to totalitarianism, and the apocalypse, which is often specifically about climate change. So maybe you could, I'm sort of collecting a bunch of questions here. So what do you feel is the role of these forms of literature? And are they, as you're reading them, are they contributing usefully to discussion, or are they more contributing to a sense of helplessness and apathy? I mean, are we leaving aside, as one of the questioners put it, whether we need rainbows and ponies? I mean, is this helpful, or is this doom and gloom and nothing can be done?
Yeah, no, and Jonathan and people who've formulated the question in this way, I think already provided the answer. I do increasingly think that they are not helpful because they don't provide exactly a space for what I talked about in the end, for agency and for agents to change anything. I understand why apocalyptic stories are, why we default to them, because certainly if we go to the story of the flood, not so much the Gilgamesh story of the flood, but the biblical story of the flood, it's clearly the flood is a response to something humans have done. So it is seen as a reaction to actions by humans, and then, of course, punishment by God, but punishments for actions done. And so it's very much virtue and sin, sin and punishment. God, in a way, has creator's remorse and wants to do away with his creation because he sees it's bad. It's interesting that Gilgamesh is not as extreme. There too, it's the gods are irked by humans, but they don't have creator's remorse. There's one god who says that who wants the flood, but sees the flood more as a kind of population control. There are too many humans. We need to call the herd, so to speak. But there isn't this kind of huge sin and punishment scenario. This is something that happens to the story once it gets taken up in the Hebrew Bible. So, and our discourse about climate change certainly is super morally charged. It's often a discourse. These are often stories about virtues and villains. The Prius driving recycler, and we can all have these figures that seem to populate this discourse, villains and virtues. It's a very moral discourse, but I think once it becomes apocalyptic, the big problem is that there's no room for agency. This is why I've been thinking much more about texts that provide agents, that think in interesting ways about agents and agency as a way forward. And the other thing I'd say about apocalyptic scenarios is, it's essentially a scare tactics. And here it seems to me that there is a strange slippage that happens when between science, the natural sciences, and the social sciences and the humanities, one way of putting it, because the scientific models, and that's their role, make very, very, very confident predictions about what will happen to the climate under certain scenarios. And so there is a sense of inevitability that is built into these kinds of predictions, as there should be. But then once you get into these larger narratives that involve dystopian human society, what gets extrapolated from this kind of science-based strong predictions or a sense of inevitability is a similar kind of decline of civilization, return to barbarism in the social realm. And I think these scenarios are far from certain. There's so many assumptions about the resilience or not resilience of human societies to adapt to climate change that I see a huge slippage from the strong predictive power of climate science to the much more uncertain predictive power of the social sciences and the humanities. And so that's another thing that worries me about climate change, that these kinds of apocalyptic social scenarios that get spun then present themselves with a similar kind of inevitability. And I think that, again, doesn't leave room for agency.
Interesting. So the predictive or poorly predictive, as opposed to the retrospective on past apocalypse, like the destruction of Eden or something.
Yeah.
You talk about collective agency, and there's a couple of nice questions about that. I'll put two together. One is, can you think of examples of storytelling promoting collective agency to solve collective challenges, perhaps by non-linear systemic approaches? And then there's another question about, is maybe fan fiction a way to be a bridge from hero stories to collective agency stories?
Yes, I'm so glad. I've been thinking a lot about fan fiction, especially in relation to collective storytelling, because it's one reason. It's so interesting returning to my earlier remarks about the importance of writing formats and writing technologies. I think that the internet, this kind of interest, of course, emerged because of the fact that we lived through a writing technology. So this big picture question, in a sense, was thinking about earlier moments when this happens. But what I find so interesting about the internet from that perspective is how many of the older forms of storytelling and formats come back, including scrolling down the screens, tablets, but also collective storytelling. The Gutenberg world was very much the world of individual authors and mass readership. But the internet, by lowering the barriers of entry for authors, has created incredible space for collective authorship. And fan fiction websites are one of the most exciting places where this happens. Collective storytelling by crowdsourced storytelling. So I couldn't agree more. So I think in some sense, fan fiction, especially fan fiction aggregators, are in a way our version of these frame tale story collections that I mentioned in the ancient world. So I think that's a really great point, and something that I keep thinking very much about.
Let's go to another format, which is the oral tradition, particularly in indigenous storytelling. There's a number of nice questions about, the indigenous peoples who, in many cases, are living in a more natural world or a less industrialized world, and maybe they're seen as the guardians of it. Is there anything to learn from indigenous people's storytelling about how climate change or resources are managed?
Absolutely. And for me, that was another sort of eye-opening aspect, by the way, of this big picture analysis of writing technologies. Because when I started this analysis, I think the picture I had in mind, or the scenario I had in mind, was something like, the world is a purely oral world, then writing emerges in one little corner of the world, writing spreads, takes over more and more, you have mass literacy, and oral storytelling sort of gets pushed to the margins. But I quickly realized that that's actually not what happens, that oral storytelling continues to thrive incredibly strongly throughout these 4,000 years of writing, alongside writing, and gets changed and interacts through writing. This is why I included such case studies as the Epic of Sunjata, but also fairy tales, for example, since Kurt Vonnegut mentioned Cinderella. These were oral traditions until the 19th century. Not indigenous, but oral traditions that existed alongside writing. So I think the devaluing of oral tradition that is very common in writing-based societies have blinded us against to really valuing this oral story, all kinds of oral storytelling traditions in general. And here again, I would say that actually the internet is yet another way in which a new writing technology or a new technology that has impacts writing and reading and how written words circulate has, of course, become a huge platform for oral storytelling as well. But you mentioned indigenous oral storytelling, and of course that's particularly important because here what is preserved in indigenous storytelling are entire, long, sophisticated, important traditions that the written world just hasn't been paying attention to and hasn't been taking seriously. So rethinking the relation between writing and oral storytelling is hugely important. It's important for specific questions of sustainable practices that you mentioned, but it's also a really important record of past catastrophes. So, for example, in the West, oral storytelling traditions preserved memories of past tsunamis that impacted the West Coast, especially in Oregon, of the United States. So these oral storytelling traditions are just also hugely important memory places of memories that we need to draw on, and people have begun to draw on. This is something that, by the way, eco-criticism has become very good at, thinking about indigenous storytelling, but more has to be done. So yes, that's a great question and a really exciting development.
I want to pull on some of the threads that you mentioned as you're going there. You mentioned fairy tales. It's a nice question here from Tanya Wang. So how do you define fairy tales? And do you think to some extent fairy tales could share similar inner structure with epic stories? If so, how could that influence our way of understanding stories and storytelling?
I think the answer is yes. In fact, the kind of, we call it structural or narratological approach that I gave you a sort of little glimpse of these different storytelling types and the shapes of stories is actually something that literary studies pioneered. There's a Russian literary critic by the name of Vladimir Prop who analyzed fairy tales, Russian, French, German, European fairy tales. This is what he had access to, and realized that, or at least he made the claim, a very convincing claim, that they had a very sophisticated analysis of 52 different functions and elements. And out of those, he could reconstruct every single fairy tale that he had access to. So fairy tales are actually a great object of study for this kind of structuralist approach, in the sense of looking at structures of stories. And then people like Joseph Campbell could use that, or did a similar thing with epic stories, and there are definitely overlaps. For example, there's often in fairy tales a donor figure, someone who helps the hero acquire certain technology or a certain piece of information, or helps in other ways. Such donor figures are very important in fairy tales. The whole story of the quest is also often part of fairy tales. So yes, fairy tales by themselves really were behind this kind of structuralist analysis of literature more generally. that was then also in interesting ways applied to epic stories and other kinds of stories.
Excellent. Let's also think about, we talked before about the potential for stories about collective agency, but what about collective stories? One question is, do you see social media as a kind of collective storytelling? And if so, is that, first of all, is that good or bad? But I guess more importantly, is it, if there is collective storytelling, does it actually make the story less powerful because there is no author or one genesis to point to?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I'd say two things about it. First, the observation that the individual author, the idea that stories are invented, original stories are invented by individual authors who own them and can sell them on the marketplace, is a very modern invention. Most of the texts that I mentioned, in fact, all of the texts I mentioned don't have an author. So they are all in some sense collective. They emerged from different versions that editors and oral storytellers and scribes collectively collected and rewrote and forged into literature, often a process of hundreds of years. So these kinds of more collective stories were, for the longest time, if we take these 4,000 years, at least 80% of that is stories without an author. And our modern world of individual authors and ownership and the emphasis on originality and copyright and so on and so forth, all these are pretty recent inventions on the whole. So if we go back to it, we shouldn't think, oh my God, this is something completely crazy. What happens? How can that have any value? It's actually a return to an earlier form of storytelling. Now, having said that, of course, the internet has made possible this incredible cacophony of stories. And I think what's happened in the past is a process of collecting, because it was so hard for stories to survive. Writing technologies were rare. Enormous cultural resources had to be spent for the copying and recopying of stories, that there were a lot of pressures on stories. And so many stories fell by the wayside. Stories were consolidated, and only certain stories survived. So there was sort of a process of consolidation and culling. And so it will be interesting to see how and to what extent this happens with the mind-boggling scope of storytelling that happens on the internet. Now, in some of these fan fiction websites, there are mechanisms for that, where you can vote, and where people vote with their feet by continuing certain fan fictions and not others. So we are now it's a question of filters and canons and canon formation and again crowdsourcing that happens. And because the internet is so young, I think it can feel overwhelming, but I think we can see emerge mechanisms of filtering and concentrating this collective and channeling. And so I suppose something like that ought to happen. And maybe we should think more about how that happens.
It's very helpful. We'll have time for just one more question, Martin. And this gets to the flourishing world of cli-fi and speculative fiction, et cetera. But I want to go back to what we were saying about apocalyptic fiction and dystopian fiction. And you were saying that these often aren't that helpful, in part because they are at some level moralizing, or that they seem to be predictive when they're imperfectly so, and they lend an air of inevitability to a destructive end. Are there stories that you're seeing that are, again, speculative and future focused, but that are not so apocalyptic, not so formed at destruction, or even ones that can be helpful as resources to people, whether those be adults or children?
Yeah. I actually don't have the one great recommendation to give, but it's interesting how I guess I'll answer a little bit differently. Namely, it's interesting, and it's actually connected to the earlier question too. So my friend and our Harvard colleague, Maya Jasanoff, was this year's chair of the Booker Prize committee, one of the most important literary prizes. And she mentioned just how many climate-related stories were submitted to the Booker Prize committee. Which itself is interesting, because for a long time, these kinds of stories were sort of dismissed by the literary establishment as sort of genre fiction, along with science fiction and fantasy. And it's interesting what we're seeing, that in the rarefied world of high literature, such as it's represented by Booker Prize and others, that there is climate fiction and related, what used to be called genre fiction, have really broken that barrier. So I think that's great, because it also means that a greater range of authors will try their hand at climate fiction, or will write, in a sense, climate fiction is coming out of its subgenre world and entering the world of literature more generally. So I think we'll see really kind of, I hope, I mean, this is I suppose not a prediction, but a hope that will bring with it an expansion in the kinds of genres that we see in literature. I actually don't have a great example or my favorite. I mean, Richard Powers is like, I mean, there are many great writers about climate change, but right now, the vast majority still seems to be defaulting to these other story types.
Good. Well, I'm sorry that we don't have time for more questions, but Martin, I really appreciate your time. And thank all of you who have joined us today. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of this one tonight, as well as the past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events. We'll put that in the chat as well. vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events.